Greetings, loyal viewers, and welcome back. Now, if you were curious as to what video game I was referring to in the last reaction video, I was of course referring specifically to, as you would probably guess from the title, Borderlands. Now, I'm referring specifically to the first one, not the second one, although I am definitely going to replay the second one again at some point, because I absolutely adore the shit out of the second game. I still really like the first game, and the pre-sequel, it's not bad. It's just not exactly, it doesn't exactly have the things that make the first and second game strong on their own. The first for its simplicity, but still fast-paced action, and the second game for how much more challenging it is, but also because it gives us a lot more and tweaks some areas like more frequent checkpoints, and so on. So, as you can imagine, I'm definitely looking forward to watching this video, which is a very interesting theory that I never really thought about, and that is Krieg the Psycho, Krieg being the Psycho that you can play as from DLC, who's also my favorite. He is a little more challenging to adapt to than the other characters, but that just makes it more fun in my opinion. So anyway, is he the father of Tiny Tina? Something I never really considered before, if I'm being completely honest. I'm not really against whatever this person has to say in regards to that theory. So, but in the end, this should definitely be very interesting. So, without further ado, let's get it on. Is Krieg her father? I don't know. Is he?
So one of the biggest mysteries surrounding Borderlands 2 is the question of who Tiny Tina's parents are.
I'll be honest, I kind of been wondering that
during
myself.
One of the echologues that appear in the game.
Yeah, you get those from that observatory thing.
Or do
I think is what that
there
place
isn't a whole lot we can say about Tiny Tina's mother, one of the popular theories amongst the Borderlands community is that Krieg is actually Tiny Tina's father. After all, both are a little crazy, they love explosions, and if the theory is true, it could present some amazing story opportunities for Borderlands 3.
I
In today's
actually,
video, I'd like to
now that I
talk
think about it, that
Krieg
would be
is Tiny
interesting.
Tina's father, and I'll be presenting a lot of evidence that seems to indicate this, as well as some evidence that points to the contrary. So I guess without further ado, let's talk a little bit about Tiny Tina's origins. So we know that Tiny Tina and her family were sold to Hyperion for slag experimentation.
Yeah, I love the
fact,
side
part of the
quest
reason
for
that
that,
Tiny
by the
Tina
way. It's
has you
freaking
capture
awesome.
Flesh Stick during the You Are Cordially Invited line of side quests is so Tina can exact her revenge on Flesh Stick, who is later confirmed to have sold out Tiny Tina, along with her parents, to Hyperion in one of the echologues that is obtained from the Doctor's Orders side quest. Now, while the third echolog specifically mentions Flesh Stick as a Hyperion liaison, we know for sure that Tiny Tina was captured upon obtaining the fourth echo for Doctor's Orders, where we get to hear Tiny Tina's voice, along with the voice of her mother and what we can presume to be Tiny Tina's father.
Yeah.
And here are both the third and the fourth echologs.
Oh god, he's gonna play
quest.
that. Oh god, no. Those echologs were fucked.
Don't worry, honey. Everything's gonna be okay. Baby, don't look. Sweetheart. Remember that heavy red rock I told you to hide in your drink?
God, that is just fucked.
Then at the top. Then throw it at the wall. Mommy? Just run. Tina!
Jesus.
Basically, what all of this tells us is that Flesh Stick ratted to Hyperion about Tina's family, then Hyperion formed slag experiments on Tina's parents, and at some point, Tina's mother instructed Tina to escape. And eventually, the player gets to meet Tina, and then you help Tina capture Flesh Stick so she can get
No wonder
revenge.
she's kind of
Now, you may be
screwed in the
wondering
head.
what this has to do with Krieg. Well, it's worth mentioning that Krieg is also a Hyperion experiment, and if you check his bounty picture, it specifically says that Krieg is Hyperion property, and that he is wanted for approximately $100
I don't think
million.
anybody, any of the other
It also
posters said
appears
that
that
specifically.
based on some of the things that Krieg will randomly say as you play through Borderlands 2, that he was experimented on with slag. In fact, one of Krieg's quotes specifically mentions a psychopathic purple liquid, and here is what he specifically says about that.
You're gonna scream just like she did.
Wow.
Open mouth, open heart, blood and noise forever piercing my skull, poisoning me with its psychopathic purple liquid. We watched it all and felt the knife edge splat down the middle. Can you hear me?
I don't know why. I actually kind of remember hearing that a couple of times. I'm stopping right here. I remember hearing that a couple of times while playing this game. I didn't really think about the context of that and all other things considered, but now thinking about it, it definitely seems like a possibility. Hold on a second. Ah, my balls. Sorry you had to hear that. Anyway, back to it.
So, just like Tina's parents, it appears that Krieg was also experimented on with slag injections. It's also speculated that the line where Krieg says, quote, "You're gonna scream just like she did, open mouth, open heart, blood and nose forever piercing my skull," could be talking about Tina's mother, or at the very least, someone Krieg was in love with before he went full psycho. Another major component to suggest that Krieg is Tiny Tina's father is some more dialogue that he has. And occasionally,
Really?
while idle, Krieg will say the following.
Where is she? Is she still alive? Did she get away?
It's often believed that Krieg is talking about Tiny Tina here, and if you think about it, it's certainly possible. After all, Fleshstick did rat out Tiny Tina and her family to Hyperion to be experimented on with slag, and it does seem a little strange that Krieg would be concerned with someone else escaping. Perhaps it could have been Krieg's girlfriend at the time, or maybe it was Krieg's daughter, Tiny Tina.
And yeah, and you know, putting this together, if whenever I do replay Borderlands 2 again, because I'm doing it all the way from scratch, just because, makes me want to replay that side quest where you invite Fleshstick to Tiny Tina's funny little tea party. Makes me want to do that all the more as Krieg now. As Krieg, I mean, or Craig. Does he say Krieg or Craig? You know what, I'm just going to stick to what I've always called him for the longest time, even if someone else would call him that. I'm just going to call him Craig.
There are also a couple of other similarities between Krieg and Tina that people point to as well. And for example, Tina and Krieg seem to have a fondness for explosives. And I suppose there is the obvious, and that's the idea that both Tina and Krieg are fairly insane, due in large part to the trauma they experienced before the events of the game. And in the case of Tina, Tina's parents were killed, and in the case of Krieg, he was subject to so much torture that it just seemed to have driven him mad. While I'm not so sure about some of the similarities between the two characters indicating that they are related, it does appear that Krieg was experimented on with slag, and it also appears that Krieg does seem to be concerned with someone's escape. Again, while I suppose it might not be Tiny Tina, he's obviously thinking about somebody that escaped, and the only person we can think of that escaped from slag experimentation is Tiny Tina. Now that
I suppose that is possible, and at the same time, this is probably the last time I'm going to stop since we're already about halfway to the halfway point of the video. But that does seem possible. I honestly don't remember if it was mentioned that Krieg or Craig or whatever had a girlfriend or something. Maybe it was mentioned in his trailer. I don't know, but I do know he does develop a certain fondness for freaking Maya the Siren, one of the playable characters from Borderlands 2, one of the vanilla characters. Bless me. So, that's very interesting. Krieg is basically my favorite character to play, or Craig. I'm sticking with Craig. Consistency be darned.
we've talked a little bit about why Tiny Tina's father could be Krieg.
To the contrary.
Let's talk a little bit about why Krieg might not actually be Tina's father. So the first thing I would like to discuss is the difference between the voice of Tina's father in the Doctor's Orders echologues and Krieg's inner monologue voice. As far as I'm concerned, both are entirely different voices, as Krieg's inner monologue voice is way deeper than the voice of what we can presume to be Tina's father. And while I suppose it's possible that Gearbox could intend for that to be Krieg at some point in the future, in the current version of Borderlands 2, it's clear that Krieg's inner monologue voice and the voice of Tina's presumed father definitely don't sound the same. It's also worth mentioning that there's an article from Gearbox themselves that indicates that Tiny Tina's parents died and that she witnessed this happening. And the article specifically says, and I quote, That is, until you find out why Tina is torturing Flesh Stick. He sold Tina's parents out to Hyperion, and she had to watch them get tortured to death in front of her, which subsequently shattered her mind and turned her into the person that she is now. This sentence seems to confirm that the developers over at Gearbox intend for both of Tina's parents to be dead, and since Krieg is currently alive as of the events of Borderlands 2,
True.
that would
But
mean
then
that
again, when it
Tina
comes
and
to this
Krieg
franchise,
are
they
related.
didn't exactly
Furthermore,
have
it's worth pointing
everything
out that
fully
Krieg
planned.
and Tina seem to have totally different eyes and hair color, and while Tina appears to be blonde with blue eyes, Krieg appears to have brown eyes. And while it's possible that Tina's mother had blue eyes, and that's where Tina's blue eyes come from, if Krieg is the father, it would be more likely that Tina would have brown eyes, as darker eye colors tend to be the more dominant trait. And as for hair color,
Yeah.
while we don't know what...
Yeah, not to mention, that's not all. Usually, regardless of gender, usually the traits of the father are often, well, most of them anyway, are what's often passed down to the spawn. So basically, I'm probably one of the other exceptions. I take a lot more physical similarities to my mother than I do my biological dad. And I'll talk a little bit more about that story at some other point. But yeah, that basically confirms the other evidence to the contrary of it being impossible. Well, maybe impossible. Like I said, Gearbox is one of those kinds of companies that doesn't always seem to have everything properly planned out ahead of time for the future of a franchise. And this is all the more evident by the fact that it's taken them so darn long for them to even announce a Borderlands 3, which we still haven't gotten yet. Only hope that they actually will this year, which I am definitely hoping for.
Krieg's hair color is, some of the other head customizations that he has at the start of the game seem to indicate that it's white. Normally, this would indicate age, however, Krieg doesn't appear to look that old. Or perhaps Krieg's hair has changed color somehow due to all of the experimentation he went under. Ultimately, though, the difference in eye color does seem to point to the fact that they are not related. Then again, we don't know what Tina's mother looks like. I think it's also worth mentioning that Tiny Tina and her parents are most likely natives of Pandora. Now, Krieg, on the other hand, appears to have hunted fugitives in his previous life, and this is indicated by a piece of dialogue that
I
Krieg
think
can
they mentioned that at some
while
point.
he's idle.
If you ever kill an innocent person, I will destroy us.
Shut up!
No, that's the deal. You can kill as many of the deserving as you like, but the second your axe touches the flesh of an innocent, I'll end this. All of it. A razor to the veins, just like that fugitive we tried to grab on Hera. Remember?
Get out of my head!
I'll take that as a yes.
This would seem to suggest that Krieg has previously been to several different planets in the
I don't know why,
Borderlands
but I
universe.
find that a little
and
funny,
while I
actually.
suppose it's possible that
The,
Tiny
ending
Tina's
part of
parents
that
may have
speech.
been to other planets and then moved to Pandora, I would say that it's more likely that her parents are native to the planet, while Krieg doesn't appear to be native to the planet at all. In fact, Krieg is more similar to the other Vault Hunters, as everyone except Salvador from Borderlands 2 is from some other part of the galaxy. Something that I think's worth mentioning is that while we don't have an exact idea of whether Krieg is Tiny Tina's father, it seems like Tiny Tina would know by now. Now, granted, I suppose you could have a situation like Star Wars where Luke Skywalker had no idea that Darth Vader was his father because of the mask, but I think Tiny Tina would be able to recognize her father based on what he looks like and his general shape. After all, Tiny Tina is 13.
I suppose that's true. Hold on a second. I suppose that's true, but at the same time, you could say that with all the experiments he also was put through, that he's been tortured and mutilated until he looks practically unrecognizable. That's probably my. I'm just throwing my 2 cents into that. Before we go back any further, I want to read this one comment. I'm not giving out names, I'm not putting it up, but it says here, I think the Tina not remembering what her parents look like can easily be attributed to many different things, such as Number one, trauma can lead to suppression of painful memories. This is demonstrated throughout the entirety of, spoiler alert, the Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon's Keep, which, if you haven't played that DLC yet, you definitely should. It's a really good DLC, where she admits that she knows Roland is dead, but suppresses that throughout the story, so maybe she does remember, but doesn't want to. Certain traumatic events can lead to people completely changing their appearance as a method of coping. Spoiler alert, think It, the girl who cut her hair down short because of her father. And yes, it is also a really good movie. The 2017 one, not the miniseries. That one's more enjoyably bad. So maybe Krieg also doesn't recognize Tina because she looks and sounds different from the last time they met. Another thing, I doubt her father looked very much like a massive, roided-up meat wall with an axe. And this is what I was talking about earlier. Like, maybe she doesn't quite recognize him, because like I said, with all the experiments he's been put through, it's likely that he was tortured and mutilated all throughout the experiments to a point where he's pretty much unrecognizable from his former self. There are likely more reasons, however, I feel like this is sufficient to write off that argument against not recognizing them, but like I said, that's that person's 2 cents, and that's also mine. So, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this video here.
Years old during the events of Borderlands 2. The echolog obtained during Doctor's orders occurs sometime before Borderlands 2 and Borderlands 1, and we know that only 5 years have taken place between both games. So Tiny Tina could have been separated from her parents as early as age 8, and possibly as late as age 11 or 12. My point is that it would seem like Tiny Tina would have a pretty good idea of what her parents would look like. And this isn't a situation where she was separated from her parents at birth, therefore she doesn't have any memory of them. It just seems like to me, if you don't know who your parents look like at the age of 13, you may have a problem. So, I suppose to answer the question posed in this video's title...
Well, then again, it is Tiny Tina,
Tiny
so...
Tina's father?
Yeah, that could be a possibility.
No. I don't think that Krieg is Tiny Tina's father. And while I suppose I could be wrong about that, it just seems like Tina would recognize him at the age of 13.
I mean, I'm not
Aside
saying
from
that I'm right
Krieg's
about it,
inner
or anyone
monologue
else
voice
is right for
doesn't
saying
match what
that.
we can
It's
presume
just
to
a
be
theory.
Tina's father's voice that appears in the Doctor's Orders echologs. And I also think that Krieg is not native to Pandora like Tina and her parents might be. However, with all this said, I do think that Krieg was probably being injected with slag and was part of Hyperion's slag experimentation program around the same time as Tiny Tina's parents were. And this might explain some of Krieg's dialogue that could possibly be talking about how Tiny Tina escaped, and it would also explain Krieg's mention of a psychopathic purple liquid. Though, I suppose like I mentioned before, only Tina would really know if Krieg was her father or not. After all, Krieg doesn't really seem to remember who he is, and there are even quotes by Krieg's inner monologue where he mentions that he's beginning to remember, but Krieg's alter ego brings him into check and suppresses whatever memories that he had. I think one of the bigger things, though, is that Gearbox specifically mentioned in the article that Tiny Tina became the way she is after witnessing the death of her parents, and that would mean that she personally saw them die, and at that point, there is no way that Krieg could be her father. With this said, it's possible that Krieg may have helped Tiny Tina escape somehow, explaining once again why Krieg's inner monologue is wondering if the mysterious she escaped. At the end of the day, though, it's going to be interesting to see how things ultimately play out for Borderlands 3, and if we encounter Tina or Krieg. And
Which
it's
I'm
possible
still
that I
looking
could be
forward
totally
to.
wrong on all this.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I don't really have too much else I can say, because I think I've already said a lot throughout the video as it was playing out, and at the moments when I stopped. Boy, I've really been going on quite a while for this one, haven't I? This one's going to be a bit of a pain to properly convert into something I can upload. At least in time, anyway. Not from editing it all together, but definitely in the time it'll take to convert it into something that can be properly uploaded onto YouTube. But overall, I do like a lot of the points he brings up in this. I can definitely understand why he might not agree with the whole theory of Krieg, and yes, from this point forward, I am sticking with Krieg. I only said Krieg when I was reading that one person's comment, just because that's how it was spelled, and by accident. So, yes. Is Krieg Tina's father? I'm holding that up for speculation and waiting until Borderlands 3 to see if they possibly answer that theory. Until then, I'm just gonna stick to what it is. It's just a theory. And no, I'm not gonna pull a reference to game theory, because I did that once on one of Canadian guy's videos, and some dude, some douchebag, decided to give me crap for it. Because I guess it's kind of a popular thing to hate MatPat now. I certainly don't. I don't hate MatPat at all. I still like him, though I do agree some of his videos have gotten a little bit redundant to a point where it kind of feels like he's slowly beginning to run out of ideas for thought-provoking theories. So that's just my 2 cents, and I've been going on a while, so that's about all the time we got. If you liked the video, go ahead and comment, like, and or subscribe, and the other suggestions, leave some in the comment section below. And as always, I'm King Gargantuas, and I'll see you all next time.